Hello and welcome to Ani Short Stories. I hope you enjoy this story. I'm going to try and upload a new story each day. The Sinister Family Portrait. Chapter 1: The Auction. Holly Arnold's breath hitched as she entered the dimly lit auction hall on the Isle of Wight. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering with each movement of the chandelier overhead. She hadn't planned to spend her Friday night in a musty room filled with relics from forgotten eras, but something about the flyer for the estate sale had drawn her in. Lot 45. The Portrait. Holly didn't consider herself superstitious, but the description of the piece gave her a peculiar sense of unease. An oil painting of the Thorncroft family, circa 1890, excellent condition, provenance, Thorncroft Manor. The photo on the flyer showed an elegant yet eerie depiction of the family, dressed in their Victorian finery. Their gazes seemed alive, almost accusing. When the painting was wheeled out, Holly's heart raced. The Thorncroft family stared back from the canvas. Reginald Thorncroft, the patriarch, stood stern and tall. His wife, Beatrice, delicate yet cold, clasped her hands in her lap. Their 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, lingered at the edges, their faces solemn. But it was the youngest girl, Ophelia, who drew Holly's gaze. Her dark eyes seemed to bore into Holly's very soul. Before she realized it, her hand shot up. Sold for £150. Chapter 2: The Curse. Holly hung the portrait above the fireplace in her modest seaside cottage. It was striking, a centerpiece that added a sense of sophistication to her otherwise plain living room. Yet, the moment it was in place, an oppressive atmosphere seemed to settle over the house. That night, Holly dreamed of the Thorncrofts. In her vision, the family stood in the same positions as in the portrait, their faces eerily illuminated by moonlight. "You help us," whispered Ophelia. Holly asked, but the family only stared at her, their eyes wide with terror. She awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, the smell of seawater and decay lingering in her nostrils. Over the next few days, strange occurrences began. Objects moved on their own. Her keys ended up in the freezer. Her books arranged themselves into neat piles she hadn't created. The air in the cottage grew damp, the walls dripping with an inexplicable moisture. It wasn't long before Holly learned about the Thorncrofts' gruesome past. The family had been massacred in their manor over a century ago, their throats slit as they sat for their final portrait. The artist, who had supposedly gone mad, completed the painting in their blood before vanishing. Every owner of the painting since had met an untimely death. Chapter 3: The Haunting. The activity escalated. Holly would catch glimpses of the Thorncrofts reflected in her windows or standing at the foot of her bed. The worst was Ophelia, who appeared to Holly in her waking hours, her pale face and hollow eyes impossible to ignore. "They won't stop." Holly managed to ask. As if on cue, the room filled with a chilling wind, and the shadows in the painting seemed to writhe. Holly screamed as she saw the Thorncrofts' faces twist into expressions of pure malice. Desperate, she turned to local historian Margaret Hensley, who had written extensively about the island's haunted past. "The painting must be destroyed. But beware, the spirits will fight to protect it." Chapter 4: The Ritual. On a stormy night, Holly and Margaret prepared to burn the painting in the secluded ruins of Thorncroft Manor. They dragged the heavy frame into the crumbling stone building, where the walls seemed to echo with whispers. As Holly doused the portrait in accelerant, the Thorncrofts appeared, their spectral forms materializing around her. Reginald loomed closest, his ghostly hand reaching for her throat. "You cannot destroy us," he hissed. Margaret began chanting a banishment spell, her voice trembling but steady. Holly struck a match, her hand shaking violently. The flame touched the canvas, and a horrific scream tore through the air. The Thorncrofts' forms twisted and writhed, their faces contorting with pain as they were consumed by the flames. The fire roared, unnatural and bright, as if fueled by more than mere oil and fabric. Holly and Margaret fled the ruins, watching from a safe distance as the cursed portrait burned to ash. Epilogue. Life returned to normal for Holly after that night, though she could never quite shake the feeling of being watched. She sold the cottage and moved inland, leaving the sea and its secrets behind. One day, while visiting an antique shop in her new town, Holly froze. Propped against a dusty shelf was a painting, its colors faded, its surface cracked, but unmistakably the Thorncroft family, and Ophelia's eyes still seemed to follow her every move. Chapter 5: The Return. Holly stumbled out of the antique shop, her pulse racing. How could the painting still exist? She had watched it burn to ash. Her logical mind whispered that it might be a replica or an uncanny coincidence, but her gut screamed otherwise. At night she couldn't sleep. Images of Ophelia's eyes haunted her, replaying over and over in her mind. Every shadow in her room seemed to stretch too long, every creak of the floorboards too deliberate. By midnight she was convinced she could hear whispers, a faint chorus of voices, growing louder with each passing hour. "You should have left us," a chilling voice hissed near her ear. Her new home, miles away from Thorncroft Manor, now felt just as oppressive as the cottage had been. Holly turned on every light and sat trembling, her back pressed to the wall. She couldn't escape the feeling that the Thorncrofts had found her. Chapter 6: The Antique Dealer's Tale. The next morning, Holly returned to the antique shop, her fear overridden by a desperate need for answers. She confronted the shopkeeper, an elderly man with sharp, knowing eyes. "That painting," she said. The man frowned, then nodded as if he'd been expecting her. "A curious piece, isn't it? Came into my possession just last week. Strange thing is, no one ever remembers selling it to me. It just—" Holly's blood ran cold. "You don't know its history?" He chuckled darkly. "Enough to know it's cursed, but some curses bring profit. People are drawn to it, fascinated by it, and sometimes," his voice dropped, "it's drawn to them." "Burn it," Holly said firmly. The man shook his head. "You can't destroy it, miss. You only think you can. It always comes back." Chapter 7: The True Origin. Determined to break the curse once and for all, Holly dove deeper into the Thorncrofts' past. She discovered that Reginald Thorncroft had not been the family's victim, but their executioner. He had murdered his wife and children in a fit of jealousy, accusing Beatrice of infidelity. The artist, who had been present, was forced at knife point to paint their final moments as Reginald's ultimate act of control. The Thorncroft spirits, fractured by betrayal and bound by Reginald's dark will, were trapped in the painting to torment the living. But there was a glimmer of hope. A legend spoke of a ritual that could free the spirits, severing their ties to the mortal world. It required confronting the spirits within the painting itself, an act that could kill whoever attempted it. Chapter 8: Into the Portrait. Holly returned to the antique shop under the cover of darkness, the Thorncroft's portrait wrapped in cloth in her arms. The shopkeeper watched her with a grim expression, but said nothing as she carried it to her car. Back at her home, Holly prepared the ritual. She lit candles around the room, reciting the incantation she had found in her research. As the last word left her lips, the room grew icy cold, and the painting began to shimmer. Before she could react, the world around her dissolved, and she found herself inside the portrait. The Thorncrofts stood before her, their spectral forms more solid and menacing than ever. Ophelia stepped forward, her small hand reaching for Holly. "You came," the girl said. "Do you want freedom?" Holly asked, her voice wavering. Reginald roared with fury. "Freedom? They belong to me?" He lunged toward Holly, his ghostly figure shifting into something monstrous. Chapter 9: Breaking the Curse. Holly ran, weaving through the painted landscape, the Thorncrofts in pursuit. The air was thick with screams and whispers, each step dragging her closer to exhaustion. She stumbled into a room, the same room where the family had been murdered. Bloodstains marred the walls, and the artist's brush lay abandoned on the floor. Grabbing the brush, Holly felt the surge of energy. The painting was alive, but it could be rewritten. Ignoring the approaching specters, she dipped the brush into the spilled paint and began to alter the scene. She painted Reginald's face with fear instead of rage, his hands bound instead of reaching for his family. Reginald howled as his form began to dissolve. The Thorncrofts stood frozen, their eyes wide as they slowly faded into light. Ophelia was the last to go. "Thank you," she whispered. Chapter 10: The Final Goodbye. Holly awoke on the floor of her living room, the portrait in ashes before her. The oppressive atmosphere was gone. replaced by a serene stillness. She knew the Thorncrofts were finally at peace. Months later, Holly received a package with no return address. Inside was a small, faded photograph of Ophelia, smiling gently. "I know it accompanied it. For your kindness, you gave us freedom." Ophelia, though she kept the photo, Holly vowed never to go near another antique painting again. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she swore she could still hear Ophelia's voice, soft and grateful, lingering in the air. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. Please don't forget to like, and even better, like and subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you have had a great day.